The Willow Creek Courthouse, a squat brick building in the heart of Tennessee, stood as a relic of better days, its faded red walls pocked by decades of rain and neglect. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of polished wood, stale coffee, and the faint tang of mildew that clung to the old benches. It was June 2025, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on Marcus Tate as he stood before Judge Evelyn Harper. At 42, Marcus was a man worn by life. His broad shoulders stooped slightly, his hands calloused from years of manual labor, his dark eyes carrying a quiet defiance. Today, he was a defendant, accused of stealing $5,000 worth of equipment from a construction site on the edge of town. The prosecution, led by Gerald Klein, a slick attorney with a penchant for theatrics, branded Marcus as broken, a drifter with no job, no family, and no hope. "You're a man with nothing to lose, Mr. Tate," Klein said, his voice sharp, as he paced before the jury. "No steady work, no roots in Willow Creek. Why wouldn't you take what wasn't yours?" Marcus didn't flinch, though the word broken cut deeper than any insult he'd heard in his years of scraping by. He'd been a mechanic, a farmhand, a delivery driver, whatever paid the bills. His life was a patchwork of odd jobs, late-night shifts, and the occasional kindness from strangers who saw past his rough exterior. But now, the jury saw only the grainy security footage of a man who vaguely resembled him, a witness who swore. Marcus was at the scene, and a toolbox pawned at a shop he'd visited before. The evidence was flimsy, but Klein's narrative was damning. Sarah Delgado, Marcus's public defender, was young, barely 27, with a law degree still fresh and a nervous energy that betrayed her inexperience. She fought hard, pointing out gaps. In the prosecution's case, no fingerprints, no clear motive, a timeline that didn't quite add up. But the jury's faces were stone, their arms crossed, their minds seemingly made up. Marcus could feel their judgment, heavy as the humid Tennessee air. Judge Harper, a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned forward. "Mr. Tate, the evidence paints a picture. If you've got something to say, now's the time." Marcus's gaze dropped to the defense table, where a single item rested, a folded piece of cloth, faded and worn, sealed in a plastic bag. It was his ace, his truth, but he wasn't ready to play it yet. Not until the moment was right. "I didn't steal nothing," he said, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of his Tennessee roots. The courtroom murmured, and Harper's gavel cracked, silencing them. "Order," she said, her tone firm but curious, as if she sensed there was more to Marcus than the broken man Klein described. The first day dragged on, with Klein hammering Marcus's character. Witnesses testified about his spotty work history, how he'd been let go from the auto shop after a downturn, how he'd worked odd jobs at farms and warehouses, how he'd been seen at the pawn shop more than once. Sarah countered, highlighting the lack of physical evidence. But her arguments felt like whispers against Klein's booming accusations. During a recess, Sarah pulled Marcus into a cramped hallway, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, her eyes wide with worry. "Marcus, they're not buying it. You've got to give me something to work with. Where were you that night? Who can vouch for you?" Marcus's fingers tightened around the plastic bag, the cloth inside soft but heavy with meaning. "I got something," he said quietly. "But it's got to wait." Sarah frowned, her frustration evident. "Wait for what? They're tearing you apart in there." He met her gaze, his eyes steady. "The right moment," she sighed, sensing she wouldn't budge him. Marcus wasn't the type to spill his thoughts easily. He was a man of few words, forged by years of solitude and survival. Back in his cell that night, Marcus sat on the thin mattress, the plastic bag in his lap. The folded cloth inside was more than fabric. It was a flag, a small tattered American flag, the kind draped over a soldier's coffin. It was a piece of his past, a reminder of who he'd been before life wore him down. Closing his eyes, he let the memories flood back, the blistering heat of an Iraqi desert, the crack of gunfire, the weight of a promise made to a dying friend. He wasn't broken, no matter what Klein said. Soon, they'd all know it. The second day of the trial broke under a sky heavy with humidity, the kind of Tennessee morning where the air clung to your skin like a second shirt. Marcus sat at the defense table, the plastic bag tucked inside his jacket, his hands clasped to keep them still. The courtroom was packed, the townsfolk of Willow Creek drawn by the spectacle of a local man on trial. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Words like drifter, trouble, and broken stung Marcus's ears, but he kept his face impassive. Sarah Delgado was a mess of nerves, her notes scattered across the table like leaves after a storm. She'd spent the night poring over case files, searching for cracks in Klein's story, but the prosecution's case was like a wall of river rock, solid, unyielding, built on half-truths. The jury needed a reason to believe Marcus, and so far he'd given her nothing but silence and that mysterious bag. Klein called his next witness, Hank Grayson, a construction foreman with a barrel chest and a voice that filled the room like a foghorn. Hank swaggered to the stand, his work boots leaving faint dirt marks on the floor. He testified that he'd seen Marcus near the construction site the night of the theft, lingering by the chain-link fence under a flickering streetlight. "You're certain it was Mr. Tate?" Klein asked, his tone almost theatrical. "Dead certain," Hank said, pointing at Marcus. "Ain't many folks in Willow Creek built like him. Tall, broad, moves like he's carrying the world." Sarah stood for cross-examination, her voice steady but thin. "Mr. Grayson, it was dark that night, wasn't it? The site's lighting is spotty at best. How can you be sure it was my client?" Hank shrugged, his confidence unshaken. "I know what I saw, lady. His face, his walk. It was him." The jury nodded, and Marcus felt the weight of their stares. He knew Hank was lying. Marcus hadn't been anywhere near the site that night. He'd been at the VFW hall, nursing a warm beer and listening to old-timers swap stories about Korea and Vietnam. But the VFW crowd wasn't the type to keep receipts or mark calendars, and Marcus had no one to back him up. Klein piled on more evidence. Receipts from the pawn shop showing Marcus had sold tools in the past, a blurry photo of a hooded figure. Near the site, a statement from the pawn shop owner, who claimed Marcus had been in just days before the theft. None of it was definitive, but it was enough to weave a story the jury could believe. Sarah fought back, questioning the footage's clarity and the pawn shop owner's credibility, but her words seemed to bounce off the jury's skepticism. During a recess, Marcus sat in a holding room, the plastic bag in his hands. Sarah paced, her heels clicking on the linoleum. "Marcus, you've got to testify. Tell them where you were, what you were doing. This silent act isn't working." Marcus shook his head, his fingers tracing the edges of the folded flag through the plastic. "I'll talk when it's time, not before." Sarah threw up her hands. "When, Marcus? When you're locked up for something you didn't do?" He didn't answer, just looked at the bag. The flag inside was more than a relic. It was a piece of his soul, a tether to a time when he'd had purpose. It was the flag of Corporal Daniel. Reese, his brother-in-arms, handed to him in a blood-soaked moment in Fallujah. Marcus had carried it through every hardship since, a reminder of a promise he'd made to live a life worth Daniel's sacrifice. Back in the courtroom, Klein continued his assault, calling minor witnesses who added to the narrative of Marcus as a desperate man. Sarah called a former co-worker, a grizzled mechanic named Joe, who vouched for Marcus's honesty, but it did little to sway the jury. They wanted hard proof, not stories. As the day ended, Marcus caught Judge Harper's eye. She looked at him, with a flicker of curiosity, like she sensed there was more to him than the broken man Klein described. That night, in his cell, Marcus held the flag, his thoughts drifting to Fallujah. The heat, the chaos, the moment Daniel pressed the flag into his hands. "Live for both of us," Daniel had said, his voice fading. Marcus had kept that promise, even when life tried to break him. Tomorrow, he'd tell his story. Tomorrow, they'd see. Day 3 dawned with a restless energy, the courtroom buzzing, like a hive before a storm. Marcus sat straighter, his jaw set, the plastic bag now inside his jacket pocket. Sarah had begged him to take the stand, and today he'd agreed. It was time to show them who he was. The prosecution rested, and Sarah called Marcus to the stand. The room fell silent as he walked forward, his boots echoing on the hardwood. He took the oath, his voice steady, and sat, meeting Judge Harper's gaze with a quiet resolve. The jury watched, their faces a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Sarah started gently, asking about his life in Willow Creek, his struggles, his work. Marcus answered in short, deliberate sentences, his Tennessee drawl, soft but clear. He spoke of losing his job at the auto shop when the owner retired, of picking up farm work and delivery gigs to survive, of the nights he'd gone to bed hungry to pay rent. But he denied the theft, his voice unwavering. "I wasn't at that site," he said. "I was at the VFW, same as every Thursday, playing darts and talking with the old-timers." Klein pounced during cross-examination, his questions sharp and relentless. "No one at the VFW can confirm your story, Mr. Tate. No receipts, no witnesses. That's awfully convenient, isn't it?" Marcus didn't blink. "I don't need folks to remember me. I know where I was." The jury shifted, unconvinced, their eyes drifting to Klein's smug expression. Sarah, sensing the moment slipping, asked her final question. "Mr. Tate, do you have anything to show the court? Something that might help us understand you?" Marcus nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the plastic bag, placing it on the stand. The room leaned forward, whispers rippling through the crowd. Even Judge Harper raised an eyebrow, her pen pausing. "This," Marcus said, holding up the folded flag, "is who I am." Klein scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "A piece of cloth, Mr. Tate? That's your defense?" But Marcus didn't. Look at him. He locked eyes with the jury, his gaze burning with something fierce and unbroken. "This ain't just cloth. This is my brother's flag. Corporal Daniel Reese, U.S. Army. Died in my arms in Fallujah, 2004. Gave me this flag. Told me to keep it safe, to live a life worth his sacrifice." The courtroom went still. Marcus's voice cracked, but he pressed on, his words raw and heavy. He told of his time in the Army, the bond he'd formed with Daniel, a kid from Ohio with a quick laugh and a dream of opening a diner. He described the ambush in Fallujah, the screams, the dust, the blood. He recounted the moment Daniel, barely 22, pressed the flag into his hands, his final words a plea to keep going. "I ain't perfect," Marcus said, his voice low. "I've stumbled, lost my way, but I don't steal. I don't break promises. And I ain't broken." Sarah's eyes widened. She hadn't known about the flag or Daniel. She seized the moment, asking Marcus to elaborate, letting his story fill the room. When he finished, the jury was silent, a few wiping their eyes. Judge Harper cleared her throat, her voice softer than before. "Thank you, Mr. Tate. You may step down." Klein tried to recover, arguing that the flag didn't disprove the theft, but his words felt hollow. The jury was looking at Marcus differently now, seeing the man behind the accusations. Sarah closed the day with a plea for them to consider Marcus's character, his service, his truth. That night, Marcus lay in his cell, the flag beside him. He felt lighter, though the fight wasn't over. The flag was his anchor, a reminder that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the odds. By day 4, Willow Creek was alive with talk of Marcus Tate. His testimony about the flag had spread, like wildfire, fueled by gossip at the diner, the gas station, and the Sunday church services. The courtroom was packed, with familiar faces and strangers alike, some drawn by support, others by curiosity. The VFW crowd had started showing up, old veterans with faded caps and weathered hands, their presence a quiet show of solidarity. Sarah called more witnesses to bolster Marcus's case. A former neighbor, Mrs. Clara Evans, testified about how Marcus had fixed her car for free when she couldn't afford a mechanic. A farmer named Tom Riley spoke of Marcus's hard work baling hay during a brutal summer, never complaining despite the heat. Their stories painted a picture of a man who, despite his struggles, had never stopped helping others. But Klein was relentless, twisting each anecdote into proof of Marcus's desperation, his motive for theft. The turning point came when Sarah called a surprise witness, Ellie Monroe, the VFW's bartender. Ellie was a wiry woman in her 50s with a sharp tongue and a memory sharper than most. She swore under oath that Marcus had been at the VFW the night of the theft, playing darts and swapping stories until closing time at 11 p.m. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Sarah asked, her voice steady. Ellie crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. Didn't know Marcus was in trouble till I heard about the trial. He ain't the type to go crying for help. Klein's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned Ellie's memory, the bar's dim lighting, even her sobriety that night. You expect us to believe you remember one patron out of dozens, months later? He asked, his tone mocking. Ellie leaned forward, her voice like steel. I remember Marcus 'cause he's there every Thursday. Same stool, same cheap beer. I'd bet my bar on it, the jury murmured, and Marcus felt a spark of hope. Ellie's testimony wasn't ironclad, but it was a crack in Klein's wall. Sarah followed with an expert witness, a retired sheriff who analyzed the security footage and argued the hooded figure could be anyone, given the low resolution and poor lighting. The tide was turning, but it was slow, like a river carving stone. Outside the courtroom, Willow Creek was fracturing. The veterans and their families rallied behind Marcus, calling him a hero wronged by a rushed judgment. Others, swayed by Klein's narrative, saw him as a cautionary tale, a man who'd fallen too far to climb back. The diner buzzed with arguments, some defending Marcus's service, others whispering about his past mistakes. Sarah brought Marcus updates during recesses, her voice low but hopeful. They're talking about the flag, she said, handing him a coffee. It's changing how people see you. Marcus nodded, his fingers brushing the plastic bag. Good. Let 'em talk. The day ended with Sarah preparing for her closing argument, knowing the jury was still divided. Marcus, back in his cell, thought of Daniel. His laugh, his dreams, the flag that bound them. He'd promised to live a life worth Daniel's sacrifice, but had he? The question lingered, but the flag in his hands felt like an answer. Day 5 was the crucible. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, every seat filled, the air thick with tension. Sarah had one last chance to sway the jury, and Marcus knew it rested on her words, and his flag. He sat at the defense table, the flag now out of its bag, folded neatly in his lap, its faded stars and stripes a quiet testament to his truth. Klein went first, his closing argument a masterclass in manipulation. He painted Marcus as a man undone by his own failures, a veteran who'd let his past define him, a drifter who'd turned to crime when life got hard. Sympathy doesn't erase evidence, he said, holding up the blurry photos, the pawn shop receipts, Hank's testimony. This man stole because he had nothing left to lose. The jury listened, their faces unreadable. Marcus's fingers tightened around the flag, his knuckles white. Sarah stood, her voice steady despite the nerves in her eyes. She didn't just defend Marcus, she told his story. She spoke of his service in Iraq, the bond with Daniel Reese, the flag that carried a promise. She dismantled Klein's case, pointing out the lack of fingerprints, the shaky witness accounts, the holes in the timeline. Then she held up the flag, its colors catching the courtroom's light. This is Marcus Tate, she said, her voice rising, a man who's fought for his country, for his friend, for his honor. He's not broken. He's not a thief. He's a man who deserves your trust. The jury's eyes followed the flag, some softening, others still hard. Judge Harper called a recess, and the room erupted in whispers. Marcus caught Sarah's eye and nodded, a silent thank you. She'd fought harder than he'd expected, her inexperience giving way to passion. In the holding room, she sat with him, her hands fidgeting. You did good up there, she said. The flag, it changed the room. Marcus shrugged, his thumb, tracing the flag's edges, just told the truth. The jury deliberated for hours, each minute heavier than the last. Marcus sat in the holding room, the flag in his lap, his thoughts on Daniel, the kid who'd loved diner food, who'd planned to open a place with checkered floors and jukebox tunes. Marcus had promised to live for both of them, but had he? The question gnawed at him, but the flag felt like a tether to that promise. When the jury returned, the courtroom held its breath. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, stood. We find the defendant, Marcus Tate, not guilty. The room exploded, cheers from the veterans, gasps from the skeptics. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm, tears in her eyes. "We did it," she whispered. Marcus exhaled, his shoulders sagging. He looked at the flag, its weight lighter now. "Yeah," he said softly. "We did." The trial was over, but Marcus's story was far from finished. News of his acquittal spread through Willow Creek like a summer storm, carried by gossip and the local paper's front-page headline, "Veteran cleared in theft case, flag tells his truth." The VFW threw a celebration, with Ellie Monroe pouring. Free beers and old-timers toasting Marcus with stories of their own. The flag, now displayed on a shelf in his small apartment, became a symbol of his resilience, a quiet reminder of what he'd endured. But freedom brought its own challenges. Marcus returned to his one-bedroom apartment, the walls bare except for the flag and a few faded photos from his army days. He wasn't sure what came next. The trial had cleared his name, but it hadn't erased the years of struggle, the lost jobs, the sleepless nights, the whispers that followed him still. He took walks through Willow Creek, noticing how some folks nodded now, while others averted their eyes. Sarah stopped by a week later, her public defender badge gone, replaced by a warm smile. "You're a free man, Marcus. What's the plan?" He glanced at the flag, its stars catching the morning light. "Keep going, I guess. Ain't much else to do." She nodded, her eyes bright. "You ever think about telling your story? Not just here, but beyond? People could learn from it." Marcus frowned, rubbing the back of his neck. "Ain't one for speeches, Sarah." "You don't need to be," she said. "Just be you." The idea took root. Over the next few weeks, Marcus started volunteering at the VFW, talking to younger veterans about his time in Iraq, the flag, the trial. His words were rough, unpolished, but they carried weight, and the kids listened, their eyes wide. The town began to see him differently, not as a drifter, but as a man who'd faced the fire and walked out stronger. One evening, Hank Grayson, the foreman who'd testified against him, showed up at the VFW, his hat in hand. "I was wrong about you," he said, his voice gruff. "Thought I saw you that night, but I'm sorry, Marcus." Marcus studied him, then extended a hand. "We all make mistakes, Hank." Life wasn't perfect. Marcus still took odd jobs, still counted pennies at the end of the month. But the flag on his shelf reminded him he was more than his hardships. He was a man who'd kept a promise, who'd stood tall when the world called him broken. Winter settled over Willow Creek, the air sharp with the promise of snow. Marcus found a steady job at a local garage fixing cars and mentoring a young apprentice named Caleb, a kid with a quick temper but a good heart, who reminded Marcus of himself at 20. The VFW became his second home, a place where he could share his story without fear of judgment. He started a small group for veterans, a space to talk about the things that haunted them: war, loss, the struggle to find a place in a world that moved on without them. The flag stayed on his shelf, a quiet sentinel. Late at night, Marcus would hold it, remembering Daniel's laugh, his dreams of a diner with greasy burgers and milkshakes. The flag wasn't just a relic, it was a lifeline, a reminder that Marcus had survived for a reason. He'd kept his promise to Daniel, even when life tried to break him. Willow Creek had changed too. The trial had forced the town to confront its quick judgments, its tendency to write off those who didn't fit the mold. The diner buzzed with stories of Marcus's veteran group, how he was helping kids like Caleb find their way. Even Judge Harper stopped by the garage one day, her stern face softened by a rare smile. "You surprised me, Mr. Tate," she said, leaning against a toolbox. "Keep surprising the world." Marcus chuckled, wiping grease from his hands. "Just trying to keep a promise, Your Honor." On a cold December evening, Marcus stood at the VFW, addressing a crowd of veterans, their families, and a few curious townsfolk. He wasn't a natural speaker, but tonight, the words came easy. He held up the flag, its faded colors glowing under the bar's dim lights. "I ain't special," he said, his voice steady. "But this is. It's a reminder that we all carry something: promises, pain, hope. Don't let nobody tell you you're broken. You're still here, and that's enough." The room erupted in applause, and Marcus felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living, building a life worth Daniel's sacrifice. To you, reading this story, Marcus's journey is a testament to resilience, to the power of truth in the face of judgment. If his story moved you, consider supporting our channel. Your help keeps these stories alive, shining a light on the people who fight through the darkness. Visit our page, share your thoughts, and join us in telling the tales that matter.